The cabin lights were dimmed, but the tension was bright as day. Up in first class, a baby's cry sliced through the low hum of the jet engines like a siren no one could turn off. It wasn't the usual fussy whimper. It was full-throated, desperate. The kind of sobbing that comes from deep frustration or exhaustion, maybe both. Every passenger within earshot had long since stopped pretending not to notice. Some buried their faces in books they weren't reading. Others adjusted their noise-canceling headphones with a little more force than necessary. A few exchanged glances that said everything without a single word. How long is this going to last? At the center of it all sat a man in a tailored charcoal suit, his tie slightly loosened, dark circles under his eyes betraying a night that had started long before boarding. He held his son, barely 8 months old, in his arms, rocking gently, whispering soft reassurances that clearly weren't working. He'd tried everything. Warm bottle? Refused. Favorite stuffed elephant? Tossed to the floor. White noise app on his phone? The baby screamed louder as if personally offended. Even the flight attendants, seasoned professionals used to handling everything from medical emergencies to drunken passengers, were running out of ideas. One of them, a woman with kind eyes and silver streaks in her neatly pinned hair, knelt beside his seat. "Sir, would you like me to hold him for a moment?" Sometimes a change in arms helps. He hesitated, then nodded gratefully. She took the baby with practiced ease, cradling him close, humming a tune under her breath. For a few hopeful seconds, the crying softened. But then the infant's face scrunched up again and the wails returned louder than before. She handed him back with an apologetic smile. "He's just really upset." The man, wealthy enough to afford 3 first-class tickets just to guarantee extra space, felt something unfamiliar. Helplessness. Money had solved nearly every problem he'd ever faced. Need a private jet? Done. A last-minute reservation at the world's hardest-to-book restaurant? Easy, but this tiny, red-faced human in his arms didn't care about his net worth, his influence, or his corner office with a skyline view. All the baby knew was that he was tired, overwhelmed, and far from the comfort of home. And no amount of privilege could fix that. Back in economy, rose behind the velvet curtain that separated the cabins like an invisible wall, a 12-year-old boy sat by the window, knees pressed against the seat in front of him. His backpack was tucked under the seat, its zipper worn thin from years of use. Inside were a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a sketchbook filled with pencil drawings of city buses and stray dogs, and a folded permission slip signed by his grandmother. He was flying alone for the first time. His mom had worked a double shift at the hospital and couldn't get off early enough to take him. But Grandma was waiting at the other end, and she'd promised pancakes for breakfast. His name wasn't important right now. What mattered was how he watched the world. While other kids his age scrolled through games on tablets or complained about the lack of legroom, he observed. He noticed how the flight attendant's hands trembled slightly when she poured coffee. He saw the elderly man in 23B clutching a photo in his wallet every time the plane hit turbulence. And now he heard the crying from up front, the kind of sound that tugged at your chest even if you didn't know why. He'd heard that kind of cry before. Back home, his baby cousin, just learning to crawl, used to scream like that whenever he got overstimulated. Too many people, too much noise, too much everything. His mom would try rocking him, feeding him, even turning on the vacuum cleaner, which somehow worked once, though no one knew why. But the only thing that ever truly calmed him was when Grandpa would sit in his old rocking chair, close his eyes and hum a tune. No words, just a low, steady melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his bones. It wasn't a song anyone knew by name. It was just his, and somehow it worked like magic. Grandpa was gone now, but the memory of that hum stayed with the boy, tucked away like a secret tool for moments just like this. Up in first class, the billionaire, because that's what he was, though he rarely thought of himself that way during moments like this, was starting to feel the heat of judgment. He caught a woman in 1A rolling her eyes as she adjusted her silk eye mask. A man across the aisle sighed loudly before muttering, "Some people shouldn't bring babies on long flights." The words stung, even though he knew they weren't entirely unfair. He hadn't wanted to bring his son on this trip, but his wife was recovering from surgery, and he couldn't leave the baby with anyone else on such short notice. He was doing his best, but best wasn't enough right now. He glanced toward the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane. He didn't usually pay attention to economy, out of sight, out of mind, but something made him look. And that's when he saw him. A boy, small for his age, sitting alone, eyes fixed not on a screen but on the scene unfolding up front. There was no annoyance in his expression, no impatience, just quiet attention, like he was trying to understand the problem. The baby let out another wail, arching his back in protest. The man's shoulders slumped. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way money couldn't armor him against. Meanwhile, the boy in economy made a decision. It wasn't bold or dramatic. It wasn't fueled by a desire for attention or reward. It was just instinct. He remembered how helpless his mom looked the first time his cousin wouldn't stop crying. He remembered the relief on her face when Grandpa's hum finally worked. If that sound could calm one baby, maybe, just maybe, it could help another. He unbuckled his seatbelt slowly, careful not to make noise. He smoothed his slightly too big hoodie and took a breath. Then, heart-thumping but step-steady, he walked toward the front of the plane. A flight attendant spotted him immediately. "Sweetheart, you need to stay in your seat," she said gently but firmly, stepping into the aisle to block his path. "I know," he said, voice low but clear. "But I think I can help with the baby." She blinked, surprised. "You do?" He nodded. "My grandpa used to hum this tune. It always worked." She glanced toward first class where the crying hadn't let up. Then back at the boy, earnest, calm, no hint of mischief. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "All right, but just for a minute, and don't touch the baby unless the dad says it's okay." The boy nodded again and kept walking. The billionaire looked up as the boy approached. For a second, confusion flickered across his face. Who was this kid? What was he doing here? But then he saw the boy's eyes, steady, kind, not asking for anything. And in that moment, pride gave way to desperation. "Can I try something?" the boy asked, stopping a few feet away. The man didn't know what to say. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't how things worked in his world, where solutions came from experts, consultants, or expensive gadgets. But his son was exhausted. He was exhausted. And the boy didn't seem dangerous, just present. "Okay," he said, voice rough with fatigue. "Just don't startle him." The boy didn't move closer. He didn't reach out. He simply stood near the edge of the first-class cabin, took a slow breath, closed his eyes for just a second, and began to hum. It wasn't loud. It wasn't fancy. Just a low, steady sound rising and falling like a quiet tide. The kind of sound that doesn't demand attention but invites calm. And something changed. The baby's cries hitched. His tiny fists, clenched tight a moment before, loosened slightly. His tear-streaked face turned toward the sound, eyes wide with curiosity instead of distress. The humming continued, soft, patient, unwavering. In the cabin, the tension began to melt. Passengers who had been stiff with irritation relaxed back into their seats. The flight attendant who'd been hovering nearby let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. And the billionaire? He stared at the boy, this stranger who'd crossed invisible lines not for fame or gain, but because he remembered a lullaby and thought it might help, and felt something shift inside him. Not just relief, something deeper, something like hope. But that was for later. For now, the baby was quiet. And in the quiet, something new began. The silence didn't last long, but it lasted long enough to feel like a miracle. One moment. The cabin had been thick with tension, the kind that makes your shoulders stiff and your jaw tight. The next, there was just the soft drone of the engines, the occasional rustle of a blanket, and that quiet hum, steady, gentle, like wind through tall grass at dusk. The baby, still cradled in his father's arms, wasn't crying anymore. His chest rose and fell in slower rhythm now. His eyes, red-rimmed and swollen just minutes before, were wide open, fixed on the boy standing a few feet away. Not with fear, not with confusion, with something closer to wonder. The billionaire didn't move. He barely breathed. He didn't want to break whatever fragile spell had just settled over them. He watched his son's tiny fingers uncurl, then curl again as if testing the air. And then, impossibly, the baby let out a sound that hadn't been heard in over an hour. A soft, bubbling giggle. It was so unexpected, so pure, that the man felt his throat tighten. He looked up at the boy, who had stopped humming now but was still standing there, hands tucked into the pockets of his hoodie, watching with quiet curiosity. "Did you learn that from someone?" the man asked, his voice softer than he'd spoken all day. The boy nodded. My grandpa. He used to hum it when my little cousin got upset. Said it was an old tune his daddy taught him. No words, just sound. There was no pride in his voice, no expectation of praise. Just a simple truth offered like a cup of water on a hot day. The man swallowed. Thank you, he said, and meant it more than he could say. I've tried everything. Bottles, toys, walking up and down the aisle. Nothing worked. The boy shrugged slightly. Sometimes it's not about what you do. It's about what you are. The words hung in the air for a beat. Simple, but carrying more weight than either of them expected. The man blinked, surprised by the depth in such a young voice. Before he could respond, the baby reached out a wobbly hand toward the boy, fingers stretching like he wanted to touch the source of the magic. The boy didn't move closer, respecting the invisible boundary. But he smiled. Just a small lift at the corners of his mouth, and the baby cooed in response. That's when the flight attendant returned, holding 2 small juice boxes and a packet of crackers. She'd been watching from a distance, not wanting to interrupt. Now she stepped forward with a warm smile. Looks like we've got a little peace treaty, she said lightly. The man chuckled. The first real laugh he'd managed in hours. More like a miracle worker. He glanced at the boy. Would you want to sit with us for a bit? At least until he settles completely. The boy hesitated. He knew the rules. Knew that first class wasn't for kids like him. Kids with worn backpacks and secondhand clothes, flying alone because their moms couldn't afford to take time off. But the man wasn't looking at him like he was out of place. He was looking at him like he'd just handed him a lifeline. And honestly, the boy was curious. He'd never been in first class before. Never seen seats that turned into beds or trays that felt like real wood, or flight attendants who asked how your day was like they actually cared. He nodded. Okay, but just for a little while. The attendant helped him stow his backpack in the overhead bin, something he'd never needed to do before, and guided him to the empty seat across the aisle. The man unbuckled his son and shifted him gently to his other arm so he could face the boy. For a few minutes, no one spoke. The baby watched the boy with rapt attention, as if trying to memorize his face. The boy pulled out his sketchbook from his hoodie pocket, not the whole thing, just a folded sheet he'd tucked inside, and began to draw. Not the baby, not the fancy cabin, just the curve of the window, the way the clouds looked like torn cotton against the deep blue sky. You draw? The man asked. Yeah, when I can. What do you like to draw? People mostly. The bus driver who always says good morning. The lady at the corner store who gives me an extra cookie if I help carry groceries. My mom when she's sleeping after a long shift. The man was quiet for a moment. In his world, art was something that hung in galleries, bought for thousands, discussed in hushed tones. But this was different. This was life, real, unfiltered, full of love hidden in ordinary moments. You've got a good eye, he said. The boy didn't blush or look away. He just kept drawing. I see things, he said simply. And I don't want to forget them. The baby made a happy noise, kicking his legs. The man shifted him again, and this time the boy reached out, not to touch but to offer the edge of his sketchbook. The baby grabbed it with both hands, grinning like he'd been given treasure. He won't tear it? The boy asked. He might, the man admitted. But it's okay. Some things are meant to be held, not kept perfect. The boy smiled again. As the flight settled into a smoother stretch of sky, conversation flowed easier. The man learned that the boy was traveling to see his grandmother, that his mom worked nights at a hospital, that he walked to school even in the rain because the bus stop was too far. The boy learned that the man wasn't always this tired, that he usually flew with a team, but today he'd insisted on going alone so his wife could rest. They didn't talk about money. Not directly. But it was there, like background music, unspoken but shaping everything. The man noticed how the boy's shoes were scuffed at the toes, how he carefully folded the juice box after sipping so it wouldn't leak. The boy noticed how the man's watch probably cost more than his entire apartment, but how he still looked like he hadn't slept in days, wealth and worry. It turned out weren't strangers to each other. Then the baby started to yawn, big dramatic yawns that made his whole body shiver. His eyes grew heavy, fluttering shut, then opening again like he was fighting sleep. He's finally giving in, the man whispered. The boy closed his sketchbook. He trusts you now, the man looked at him. Because of you. No, the boy said gently. Because you stayed, even when it was hard. Even when people were mad. That's what babies remember, not the noise, but who stayed. The man felt something crack open in his chest. He'd built empires, negotiated billion-dollar deals, stood on stages with spotlights and applause. But no one had ever said something that hit him as deeply as those few words from a 12-year-old in a too-big hoodie. He looked down at his son, now drifting off, cheek pressed against his shoulder. Then back at the boy who was already gathering his things, sensing it was time to return to his seat. "Wait," the man said. "Before you go, can I ask you something?" The boy paused. "Sure, what's your name?" The boy told him. The man repeated it slowly, like he was memorizing it. "And your grandma, she'll be at the airport?" "Yeah, gate B4, she wears a red scarf," the man nodded. He didn't pull out a business card or offer a check. He didn't make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. But he did something quieter, more human. He made eye contact and said, "Thank you, really." The boy stood. "You're welcome." As he walked back toward economy, the cabin felt different. Lighter. Not because the problem was solved, babies cry after all, but because something real had happened. Not a performance. Not a transaction. Just two people from opposite ends of the world, meeting in the middle for a few honest minutes. Back in his seat, the boy buckled up and looked out the window. The clouds were turning gold at the edges, sunset catching up with them at 35,000 feet. He thought about the baby's giggle, the way the man's voice had softened, the weight of being seen not as a poor kid or a distraction, but as someone who mattered. Up front, the billionaire held his sleeping son and stared at the empty seat across the aisle. He didn't know what came next. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about his next meeting, his next deal, his next problem to solve. He was thinking about a hum and a boy who remembered his grandpa's song, and how sometimes the most powerful things in the world aren't bought. They're given. Freely. Quietly. Without expecting anything back. The plane flew on, cutting through the sky like a needle through fabric, stitching together lives that might never have touched, except for a crying baby, a worn sketchbook, and a lullaby that refused to be forgotten. The wheels touched down with a gentle thud, and the cabin stirred to life. Overhead bins popped open, seatbelts clicked free, and the low murmur of voices returned like a tide rolling back in. But up in first class, time still felt suspended. The baby slept soundly against his father's chest, one tiny hand curled around the fabric of his shirt like an anchor. The man didn't move. He just sat there watching the clouds scatter outside the window, replaying the last few hours in his head, not as a businessman analyzing a deal, but as a father who'd just been handed a quiet revelation. Down in economy, the boy zipped his backpack slowly, making sure his sketchbook was safe inside. He glanced toward the front of the plane, half expecting the moment to vanish like a dream once they stepped off. But then he saw him. The man, still holding his son, now standing near the exit with his carry-on slung over one shoulder. He wasn't rushing. He was waiting. Their eyes met across the cabin. No words, just a nod. A silent understanding that this wasn't over. As passengers filed off in waves, the boy stayed back, letting the crowd thin. He didn't want to cause a scene. Didn't want anyone thinking he was trying to get something. He just wanted to say goodbye to the baby. Maybe see one more smile before they disappeared into their separate worlds. By the time he reached the jet bridge, the man was still there, leaning against the wall near the gate, bouncing the baby gently on his hip. The infant was awake now, bright-eyed and calm, chewing on the edge of a soft blanket. When he saw the boy, he let out a happy squeal and reached out both arms. The man smiled. "He remembers you." The boy stepped closer, hands in his pockets again. "Hey, little guy," he said softly. The baby babbled something that sounded like Baba, and the man chuckled. "I think he's trying to say your name." They stood there for a moment, three strangers bound by a single strange hour in the sky. Around them, the airport buzzed, announcements over the loudspeaker, rolling suitcases, families reuniting. But it all faded into background noise. Then a woman in a red scarf appeared at the end of the corridor, waving with both hands. Her silver hair was pulled into a loose bun and her eyes lit up the second she spotted the boy. "There he is," she called, hurrying over. "You made it." The boy turned, relief washing over his face. "Grandma." She wrapped him in a hug that lasted a beat too long, the kind that said, "I missed you," without needing words. Then she noticed the man and the baby. "Oh, hello," she said, warm but cautious. The man stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm so glad you're here. Your grandson, he helped us more than I can explain." She looked at her grandson, eyebrows raised. "He did?" "He calmed my son when no one else could." Just by humming a tune, her eyes softened. She knew that tune. Knew it came from her late husband, the boy's grandpa. She reached out and squeezed the boy's shoulder. "That was your grandpa's gift," she said quietly. "And now it's yours too." The man watched them, struck by the quiet strength in their bond. He'd built a life on metrics, revenue, growth, efficiency, but this was something numbers could never capture. "Would it be all right?" he asked carefully. "If I stayed in touch? Not as, I don't know, a benefactor or anything like that, just as someone who'd like to know how he's doing?" The grandmother studied him. She'd seen plenty of well-meaning strangers offer help that came with strings, expectations, photo ops, stories to tell at galas. But this man didn't feel like that. He looked tired, yes, but also sincere, and his eyes kept drifting back to the boy, not with pity, but with something like gratitude. She glanced at her grandson. "What do you think?" The boy didn't answer right away. He looked at the man, then at the baby who was now trying to grab his ear. "I guess," he said. "As long as you don't make it weird." The man laughed, a real unguarded sound. "Deal." They exchanged numbers the old-fashioned way, scribbled on the back of a boarding pass. No social media, no formal introductions, just two people agreeing to keep a door open. As they parted ways, grandmother and grandson heading toward baggage claim, the man and his son toward a waiting car service. Neither knew what would come next. But something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that would make headlines, but deeply, like a seed dropped into soft soil, unnoticed but full of possibility. Over the next few weeks, messages were short but steady. A photo of a new drawing, a pigeon perched on a fire escape, wings half spread. "Saw this outside my window this morning." A voice note of the baby laughing during bath time. "He hasn't cried like that since the flight. Thought you'd like to hear him happy." A simple text. "How's school?" Reply, "Okay, math's hard." "Art's good. No grand gestures. No sudden scholarships or surprise visits. Just small threads of connection woven slowly, carefully." Then came the first real ask. It was a Saturday morning. The boy sat at the kitchen table in his grandmother's apartment, sunlight streaming through the lace curtains she'd hung decades ago. His mom was asleep in the next room, finally catching up after 3 night shifts in a row. He'd been trying to finish a school project, a diorama of a city neighborhood, but his cardboard was warped. His glue dried out and the colored pencils he had were down to nubs. He stared at the half-finished buildings, frustration prickling behind his eyes. He didn't want to bother his grandma. She was on a fixed income and art supplies weren't exactly a priority. But the project was due Monday and he'd worked so hard on the design. He thought about the man, hesitated, didn't want to seem like he was asking for handouts. But then he remembered how the man had said, "Just stay in touch." Not as a favor, as a friend, so he sent a message. "Need stuff for a school project. Don't have good pencils or cardboard. Don't worry about it though." Within an hour his phone buzzed. "Where's the nearest art store to you?" the boy told him. 2 days later a plain brown package arrived at his grandmother's door. No return address. Inside, a sketch pad with thick, creamy paper, a set of professional-grade colored pencils, sturdy foam board, non-toxic glue, even a small ruler and an eraser shaped like a cat. Tucked in the corner was a note. "For the city, you see. Can't wait to see what you build." No signature. No fanfare. Just what was needed, delivered quietly. The boy sat on the floor and ran his fingers over the new pencils. They felt heavy, real. He opened the sketch pad and drew a single line. Smooth, dark, perfect. Then he started on the diorama again, this time with tools that matched the vision in his head. When he turned it in, his teacher stared at it for a full minute before saying, "This is college-level work." He didn't tell her about the package. He just smiled and said, "I had the right tools." Meanwhile, the man found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. He'd always believed success was measured in scale, bigger companies, larger audiences, higher returns. But now he caught himself noticing smaller things, the way his son's eyes lit up when he read him a story, the sound of rain on the roof during a quiet evening, the weight of a simple thank you that wasn't tied to a transaction. He started visiting community centers near his office, not to give speeches or cut ribbons, but to sit and listen. He met kids who talked about dreams that didn't involve fame or fortune, just safety, stability, a chance to create something beautiful. He heard stories about teachers buying supplies out of their own pockets, about parents working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. It didn't make him feel guilty. It made him feel awake. One afternoon, he called his assistant and said, "Cancel my lunch meeting. I'm going to sit in on a middle school art class." She didn't question him. She'd noticed the change too. At the school, he didn't introduce himself as the CEO. He just sat in the back watching kids sketch, paint, argue over who got the last tube of blue. And in one corner, a boy, small for his age, focused, hands moving with quiet confidence, reminded him of someone he knew. After class, he approached the art teacher. "Do you ever need supplies?" She laughed, but it was tired, always. "Half my budget goes to paper towels." He didn't offer to fund the whole program. Not yet. But he did say, "What if I sponsored a monthly art kit for your students? Just basics. Pencils, paper, glue. Nothing fancy." Her eyes widened. "You'd do that?" "I'd like to." And just like that, a small ripple began. Back home, the boy finished his diorama and placed it on the windowsill in his room. Every morning, he'd look at it and remember, I had the right tools. But more than that, he remembered the hum. The way it had worked, not because it was magical, but because it was true. Because it came from love, passed down through generations, offered without expectation. He started humming it sometimes when he drew, not to calm anyone else, just to remind himself where he came from and where he was going. One evening, his mom sat beside him on the couch, flipping through his sketchbook. She paused on a drawing of the man and his baby on the plane, rendered in soft pencil strokes. "Who's this?" she asked gently. He told her the story, the crying, the hum, the juice boxes, the package. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You didn't do it for anything, did you?" "No," he said, "I just remembered Grandpa." She kissed the top of his head. That's why it worked. Months passed. Seasons turned. The baby took his first steps. The boy entered a citywide art contest and won 3rd place. The man started a small foundation focused on arts education, but he kept his name off the letterhead. "Let the work speak," he told his team, and through it all the messages continued, not daily, not demanding, just enough to keep the thread alive. A photo of a mural the boy helped paint at his school, a video of the baby saying ball for the first time. A question. "What's your favorite thing to draw?" Answer. Hands, they tell stories. No one was saving anyone. No one was being rescued. They were just 2 people, different in almost every way, who had met in the middle of a storm and chosen to stay kind. And in a world that often felt loud, rushed and divided, that quiet choice was more powerful than either of them realized. Time has a way of folding moments into memory, like pages in a well-worn book. What started as a chance encounter on a long flight had quietly grown roots, deep, steady, and unseen by most. There were no headlines, no viral videos, no grand announcements, just 2 lives moving forward, each changed in ways that didn't shout but whispered. The boy was now 14. His hands were bigger, his sketches more detailed, his voice a little lower. He still lived with his grandmother during the school year, still visited his mom on weekends when her shifts allowed. Life hadn't gotten easier exactly. Bills still piled up, the radiator still groaned in winter, and the bus still ran late. But something had shifted inside him. He carried himself differently. Not with arrogance, but with a quiet confidence that came from knowing he mattered. Not because of what he had, but because of what he saw, what he remembered, and what he offered without being asked. His art had become more than a hobby. It was his language. When words failed, when his mom came home too tired to talk, when his grandma worried about rent, when the world outside felt heavy, he'd open his sketchbook and let his pencil speak. He drew the grocery store clerk who always slipped an extra apple into their bag. He drew the old man who fed pigeons in the park every Tuesday. He drew his own hands, calloused from helping neighbors carry laundry up 3 flights of stairs. And sometimes he drew the baby from the plane, now a toddler, based only on the photos sent over the years. Not as a symbol of wealth, but as a reminder. Even the smallest among us can be reached with kindness. The man, meanwhile, had stepped back from the daily grind of his company. He hadn't retired, far from it, but he'd restructured his role, handing day-to-day operations to a trusted team so he could focus on what truly moved him. He still wore expensive suits when needed, still sat in boardrooms with people who measured success in billions, but his heart lived elsewhere now. He'd quietly funded art rooms in 5 under-resourced schools, not with flashy plaques bearing his name, but with simple agreements. Keep the doors open after school. Let kids create. No grades, no pressure. He visited sometimes, not as a donor, but as a guest, sitting on tiny stools watching students mix paints or argue over perspective. He never offered advice unless asked. He just listened, and every few weeks he'd get a new drawing in the mail. No return address, just a plain envelope with a stamp and his name written in careful cursive. Inside, a single sheet of paper, covered in lines and shadows that told stories money couldn't buy. One afternoon, he received an envelope thicker than usual. Inside was not just a drawing, but a letter, handwritten on lined notebook paper. "Hey, I got accepted into a summer program at the City Art Institute. It's free for kids who show promise, which I guess I do. But they said I need my own supplies. Good brushes, canvas, oil paints. It's a lot. Grandma's saving, but I don't want her to stress. I'll figure it out either way. Just thought I'd tell you. P.S. I drew you this. It's you and your son at the airport that day. You look tired, but happy. The drawing was stunning. Not flashy, not perfect, but alive. You could see the exhaustion in the man's shoulders, the way his hand cradled his son's head like something sacred. And in the background, faint but clear, was the boy himself, small and uncertain, stepping forward. The man sat at his desk for a long time, staring at it. Then he picked up the phone. 2 days later, a courier delivered a wooden box to the grandmother's apartment. Inside, nestled in soft foam, were professional-grade oil paints, a set of sable brushes, 3 stretched canvases, a palette knife, and a tube of linseed oil. Tucked beneath it all was a note, "For your summer. Don't worry about the cost. Just paint what you see. And thank you for remembering your grandpa's song." The boy didn't cry. But he held the note for a long time, then placed it in the back of his sketchbook, right behind the drawing of the humming boy on the plane. That summer changed him. At the Institute, he met kids from all over the city, some from penthouses, some from shelters, but in the studio none of that mattered. What mattered was how you mixed your colors, how you handled light, how honest your lines were. For the first time, he wasn't the poor kid or the one who flies alone. He was just an artist. He painted a series called Everyday Heroes. Not firefighters or police officers, though he respected them, but the people no one usually noticed. The night janitor who left encouraging notes on desks, the lunch lady who remembered who liked extra pickles, the bus driver who waited an extra 10 seconds for a running kid. His final piece, a portrait of his grandmother, eyes closed, humming the same tune his grandpa used to sing, won the program's top award. The judges didn't just praise his technique. They said it made them feel something. When the man heard, he didn't send flowers or a congratulatory email. He showed up, not in a limo, not with cameras, just a man in a simple coat, standing at the back of the student gallery during the exhibition night. He watched as people paused in front of the grandmother's portrait, some even wiping their eyes. He saw the boy talking quietly to a younger student, showing them how to blend skin tones without overworking the canvas. After the crowd thinned, they found each other near the exit. "You didn't have to come," the boy said. "I wanted to," the man replied. "You made her look like she's still singing." "She is," the boy said softly, just not out loud. They walked outside together. The city hummed around them. Cars, chatter, distant music, but between them there was peace. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't walked up that aisle?" the boy asked after a while. The man smiled. "I think about it all the time. But I also think, maybe you were always meant to." The boy shook his head. "I just remembered a song." "And that's enough," the man said. "Sometimes remembering is the bravest thing we can do." Back home, the boy's mom finally got a promotion. Day shifts now, better pay, health benefits. She cried when she told them. Not from sadness, but from relief. That night, they ate pancakes for dinner, just like Grandma used to promise. The boy didn't tell her about the art supplies. Not because he was hiding anything, but because it didn't feel like a gift from someone else. It felt like a continuation of his grandpa's song, of his own hands, of a moment on a plane where one person chose to care. Meanwhile, the man began mentoring young entrepreneurs, not just in tech or finance, but in community projects, in creative ventures, in work that served people, not just profits. He told them, success isn't how much you accumulate, it's how much you connect. He still flew first class when necessary, but he always glanced toward economy before takeoff, not out of guilt, out of gratitude. And every time his son got fussy on a car ride in a grocery store during a thunderstorm, he'd hum that same wordless tune. Not perfectly, not like the boy, but enough. And every time his son would calm, eyes searching his face like he recognized the sound from somewhere deep in his bones. Years passed like seasons, some bright, some stormy, all necessary. The boy applied to art schools. Not the most famous ones, but the ones with strong community programs, with studios open late, with teachers who believed art was for everyone. He got into his top choice, full scholarship. The acceptance letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday. He read it at the kitchen table, then folded it carefully and placed it next to his grandpa's old harmonica. Never played, but always kept on the shelf. The man didn't fund the tuition. The scholarship covered it, but he did send one thing. A blank sketchbook, high quality, with a note that said, for the next chapter. No fanfare, no strings, just faith. And that was the thing no one saw coming. Not the passengers on that flight. Not the critics who said rich and poor don't really connect. Not even the two of them at first. This wasn't a story about rescue. It was about recognition. The man hadn't saved the boy. The boy hadn't fixed the man. They'd simply seen each other, truly seen. And in that seeing, given each other permission to be more human. In a world obsessed with scale, speed, and spectacle, they chose something quieter. Presence. Patience. A shared belief that kindness doesn't need an audience to matter, and as the boy packed his bags for college, tucking his favorite drawings into his suitcase, his grandma humming, the bus driver waving, the baby laughing on the plane, he knew one thing for sure. The most powerful things in life aren't built in boardrooms or bought with money. They're grown in moments like that one on the plane. Small, unexpected, and offered freely. And once planted, they never really stop growing. The gallery opening was on a Friday evening in early fall. The air outside carried that crisp edge that comes just before the world turns gold and red. And inside the downtown art space, soft lights glowed against white walls lined with framed drawings and paintings. People milled about with wine in plastic cups, murmuring appreciations, pausing longer in front of certain pieces, the ones that didn't just catch the eye, but held the heart. At the center of it all stood a young man, now 21, wearing a dark sweater and jeans, his hands tucked into his pockets as he watched strangers connect with his work. He wasn't nervous. Not anymore. He'd learned long ago that art wasn't about perfection, it was about truth. And these pieces? They were as honest as he knew how to make them. The series was called Seen. Not famous, not important, not inspiring, just seen. Each portrait showed someone the world usually walked past. The woman who cleaned office buildings at night. Her hair pulled back, eyes tired but kind. The teenager who fixed bikes for free in the park. The elderly man who fed stray cats behind the laundromat, rain or shine. No dramatic poses, no filters. Just faces, hands, postures, rendered in charcoal, ink, and soft washes of watercolor that said, I am here. I matter. A woman stood in front of one drawing for nearly 10 minutes. It was of a nurse still in her scrubs, sitting on a bus stop bench at 3 a.m., head resting against the glass, one hand holding a cold coffee, the other clutching a photo in her wallet. The young artist had drawn it from memory. His mother had looked just like that more times than he could count. When the woman turned away, there were tears in her eyes. She didn't say anything. She just nodded toward him, a quiet thank you that needed no words. That was the moment he knew he'd done what he set out to do. Across the room, near the back, a familiar figure leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching not the art but the artist. Older now, hair more silver than black. The man who'd once rocked a crying baby in first class looked on with something between pride and awe. He hadn't come as a benefactor or a guest of honor. He'd come as a friend. And he hadn't told anyone he was coming, he just showed up. Like he always did. After the crowd began to thin, they found each other by the refreshments table, cheese cubes, crackers, and cheap sparkling cider. You made them feel seen, the man said simply. The young man shrugged, but his eyes smiled. That's all I ever wanted. Not to be famous, just to help people notice each other. They stepped outside, where the city hummed in its usual rhythm, taxis honking, laughter spilling from a nearby bar, the distant wail of a siren. The sky was clear, stars faint but present above the glow of streetlights. I got a call last week, the man said after a while. From a school in Cleveland. They want to start an after-school art program like the ones we've been funding, but they asked for something different. What's that? They want the kids to draw the people in their own neighborhoods. Not heroes in capes, just real folks. The barber who gives free haircuts to kids who can't pay. The lunch monitor who remembers everyone's name. That kind of thing. The young man nodded slowly. That's the best kind of art. It is, the man agreed. And I told them I'd support it, but only if you help design the curriculum. That caught him off guard. Me? You started this, the man said gently. Not me, not the money, you, with a hum and a sketchbook. This is your vision. I'm just keeping the door open. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of those words settling like dust in sunlight. Inside, someone laughed. A door closed. A car passed by with its windows down, music spilling into the night. You know, the young man said, I used to think kindness was something you did when you had extra time, extra money, extra energy. But that flight taught me something else. What's that? That kindness is something you choose, even when you have nothing extra to give. My grandpa had nothing but that tune, and he gave it anyway. The man looked at him, really looked, at the calm in his eyes, the steadiness in his voice, and realized something. This young man hadn't just survived his circumstances. He'd transformed them into something beautiful, not by escaping them, but by honoring them. Back inside, a small boy, maybe 6 or 7, tugged his mother's hand toward one of the drawings. It was a simple piece. An old man sitting on a folding chair outside a bodega playing a harmonica, eyes closed, lost in the music. The boy pointed. That's like Mr. Louis, he whispered loudly. He plays for us after school. His mother smiled. It is, isn't it? That was the ripple. Not loud, not viral, just real. Later that night, after the gallery closed and the last guest left, the young man walked home alone. He didn't take a rideshare. He liked walking, liked feeling the city pulse beneath his feet, liked seeing the way light hit brick walls at night, liked the quiet company of his own thoughts. When he got to his apartment, a small studio near the Art Institute, paid for with part-time teaching and scholarship funds, he didn't turn on the lights right away. Instead, he went to his desk, opened his oldest sketchbook, the one with the torn corner and coffee stains, and flipped to a page near the back. There it was, a rough pencil drawing of a baby crying on a plane, and a boy standing nearby, humming. It was clumsy compared to his current work, proportions off, lines shaky, but he'd never thrown it away. Because that was where it began, not with talent, not with luck, with a choice. He picked up a fresh sheet of paper and began to draw. Not for a show. Not for school. Just because. This time he drew 2 hands, one older, one younger, reaching toward each other across an aisle. No faces, just hands. And between them, faint but clear musical notes floating in the air like breath. The next morning, the man sat in his office, not in his usual high-rise, but in a modest space above a community center. He'd moved his foundation's headquarters here 2 years ago. If we're serving people, he'd told his team, we should be near them. On his desk sat a small framed print, the gallery's invitation, with the words, "Seen," in elegant script. Beside it, a photo he'd kept since that flight. His son, maybe 2 years old, holding a crayon drawing the young man had sent him for his birthday. On it, the boy had written, "For the kid who listened to a hum." His assistant knocked lightly. The Cleveland school called again. They're ready to start next month. Good, he said. Tell them we'll send the first shipment of supplies next week, and ask if they'd be open to a virtual visit from the artist himself. She smiled. I think they'd like that. As she left, he leaned back in his chair and looked out the window. Kids were playing in the courtyard below, jumping rope, chasing each other, laughing. One of them tripped and fell. Another stopped, helped them up, brushed off their knee. No adult intervened. They just took care of each other. That was the world he wanted to help build. Not one where the rich saved the poor, or the powerful fixed the broken, but one where people simply saw each other and chose to care even when it cost them nothing but a moment of attention. He thought about that flight again. How helpless he'd felt, how the solution hadn't come from his wealth, his status, or his connections, but from a boy who remembered a song, and how that song had never really stopped playing. Years later, long after the gallery show, after the art program spread to dozens of cities, after the young man became a teacher himself, someone asked him in an interview, "What's the secret to your work? Why do people connect with it so deeply?" He didn't talk about technique or training. He said, "I draw people the way I wish the world would see them, not for what they lack, but for what they give, even if it's just a hum, even if it's just showing up." The interviewer nodded, scribbling notes. "And who taught you that?" He smiled. "A baby who wouldn't stop crying. And a moment that reminded me we're all just trying to be heard." The story never went viral. There were no movie deals, no talk show appearances, no branded merchandise. But in classrooms, community centers, and quiet homes across the country, kids picked up pencils and started drawing the people around them. Not the famous, not the flawless, but the real. And sometimes, when a baby cried on a plane, a stranger would hum a soft tune. Not because they knew it would work, but because it was the kind of thing a good person does. No fanfare, no reward. Just humanity, passed hand to hand, heart to heart. And in the end, that was more than enough.